The call came on a Tuesday morning. Margaret was stirring honey into her tea when her brother's name lit up her phone screen. I remember thinking it was strange. David never calls before noon. When I answered, his voice was different, tight. "Dad signed over the house," he said. Just like that. 4 words that changed everything. The family home, the place where your mother planted rose bushes and your father built a treehouse, suddenly gone because of a signature on a contract your father believed would protect you. This is the story of Harold Bennett, a proud, independent 78-year-old widower who made a devastating financial mistake while trying to spare his children the burden of his care. And it's a story that's happening in families across the country more often than anyone wants to admit. Harold had lived in the same colonial-style house in Mapleton for 47 years. It was where he and Eleanor raised their 3 children, Margaret, David, and Lily. It was where Eleanor took her last breath 5 years ago, after a brief but brutal battle with pancreatic cancer. And in the silence that followed her passing, it became the place where Harold slowly began to fade. The first signs were small. Bills paid twice or not at all. Keys misplaced with increasing frequency. The once meticulous garden overtaken by weeds. Margaret noticed during her Sunday visits, but her father dismissed her concerns with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades being the family's rock. "I'm fine, Maggie," he'd say, using her childhood nickname. "Just getting old. Happens to the best of us." But he wasn't fine. The refrigerator contained expired milk and little else. The stairs became an enemy he battled multiple times daily. And twice in 1 month, neighbors called Margaret when they found Harold wandering the neighborhood in his bathrobe, disoriented and frustrated. After the second incident, Margaret and her siblings gathered in the kitchen, where they'd shared countless family meals. The conversation was tense, filled with the unspoken guilt that comes from realizing a parent needs more care than you can personally provide. "He can't live alone anymore," David said, his voice firm but pained. "We need to consider assisted living." Lily, the youngest and always their father's defender, pushed back. "Dad would hate that. This house is everything to him. It's his connection to Mom." But Margaret had done her research. She had toured 3 facilities and brought brochures, cost breakdowns, and a list of pros and cons. Their father needed professional care. Care that none of them, with jobs and families of their own, could provide consistently. What they didn't discuss, what they should have discussed, was how to pay for it. The unspoken assumption was that selling the house would cover most of the costs. The property had appreciated considerably over the decades, and though none of them wanted to admit it, they had each privately calculated what their share might be after their father's care was secured. The house serving as both inheritance and critical safety net. When Margaret approached Harold with their concerns and suggestions, he sat silently in his worn leather recliner, hands folded in his lap. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. "I know I've been struggling," he finally said, "but I don't want to be a burden. Not to any of you." She took his hand, noticing how the skin had thinned, revealing a map of blue veins beneath. "You could never be a burden, Dad." But Harold Bennett had been listening to a different voice, one that came from sleek mailers delivered directly to his mailbox. Glossy pamphlets from Evergreen Estates, a luxury assisted living community that had recently opened on the affluent side of town. "We understand your desire for independence and dignity," the elegant brochures promised. "And our life care agreement ensures you'll never be a financial burden to your loved ones." Harold had been quietly giving these materials his full attention, while ignoring the ones Margaret left on his coffee table. And 3 weeks before that Tuesday morning phone call, he had taken a tour of Evergreen Estates without telling any of his children. The facility was undeniably impressive, a far cry from the clinical nursing homes he associated with end-of-life care. The apartments were spacious and modern. The dining room resembled an upscale restaurant. Residents moved confidently, dressed in well-tailored clothes, giving the air of a resort more than a care facility. And when the marketing director, Veronica Palmer, invited him into her elegantly appointed office, Harold felt a sense of control returning. Here was someone who spoke to him as a capable adult making important decisions, not as a declining old man to be managed. "Our life care agreement is unique, Mr. Bennett," Veronica explained, her voice warm and reassuring. "In exchange for the deed to your home, we guarantee your care for life, no matter how your health needs might change in the future. No monthly bills, no draining your savings, no burdening your children with unforeseen costs." What Harold didn't fully comprehend, what Veronica glossed over in her practiced presentation, was that the fair market value they offered for his home was significantly below its actual worth. Nor did he understand that the contract contained provisions allowing Evergreen to sell the property immediately, pocketing the substantial difference. "Your children will thank you," Veronica assured him. "They won't have to manage your care or deal with the house after you're gone. Independence, dignity, not being a burden." These words resonated with Harold, a proud man who had always taken care of his family, never the other way around. 2 days later, without consulting an attorney or his children, he signed the papers. The contract was executed with remarkable efficiency. Within 2 weeks, Harold had packed a few cherished possessions and family photos and moved into apartment 214 at Evergreen Estates. The rest of his belongings, the physical remnants of a 47-year life in that colonial home, were relegated to a small storage unit or donated. It was David who discovered what had happened. After trying to reach his father for 3 days and getting no answer, he drove to the house only to find it empty, with a realtor's lockbox on the door. The neighbor told him Harold had moved to some fancy retirement place and provided the name. When David arrived at Evergreen Estates, he found his father settled into his new apartment, seemingly content but clearly confused about the financial arrangement he had made. "I thought you'd be relieved," Harold said, genuine bewilderment in his eyes as David questioned him. "The house was too much for me, and this way I'm taken care of. You kids don't have to worry." It was only when David asked to see the contract that the full impact of Harold's decision began to dawn on him. He immediately called Margaret, who left work mid-meeting, to drive to Evergreen Estates. As a project manager for 15 years, Margaret had solved tough problems for a living, but nothing had prepared her for the sinking feeling as she read through the life care agreement her father had signed. "Dad," she said carefully, fighting to keep her voice steady, "do you understand that you gave them the house? Not just to cover the cost of your care, but completely. They already sold it." Harold's face reflected genuine surprise. "But they said it was a fair exchange. They valued the house at $320,000. Margaret and David exchanged glances. Their father's home, in the current market, was worth at least $575,000. "And what happens if you don't like it here?" David asked. Harold's brow furrowed as he slowly processed the implication. "I didn't think about that," he admitted. "But the care is guaranteed for life. That's what matters." That night, poring over the contract at the kitchen table, Margaret felt a growing sense of helplessness washing over her. Her husband, Paul, placed a cup of tea beside her and squeezed her shoulder. "There has to be a way to contest this," he said. He clearly didn't understand what he was signing. But Margaret had already consulted with an attorney friend during a frantic phone call earlier that evening. The news wasn't good. "The contract is airtight," she told Paul, rubbing her temples. "They specifically had him evaluated by their staff physician, who declared him competent to make financial decisions. They covered their bases." She thought back to the slow changes she'd observed in her father, the memory lapses, the confusion with bills, the wandering. changes she had noticed but hadn't acted on quickly enough. Even if we could prove he has early dementia now, they have documentation saying he was competent when he signed, and legally he was. Impaired judgment isn't the same as legal incompetence. Paul sat across from her, but they clearly took advantage of him. Legally, they offered a service with clearly stated terms. The fact that the terms heavily favor them doesn't make it fraud. Her voice cracked. And they've already sold the house. Some developer bought it 3 days after Dad moved out. In the weeks that followed, Margaret, David, and Lily faced a painful reckoning. The house they had grown up in was gone. In its place was an agreement that provided for Harold's basic needs, but left nothing for unexpected medical expenses, personal wants, or future choices. More devastating was the realization that the money from the sale of the house far exceeded what Harold's care would actually cost Evergreen Estates, even if he lived another decade or more. The facility had essentially profited hundreds of thousands of dollars from an elderly man's desire not to burden his family. "I should have seen this coming," Margaret said during a tense dinner with her siblings at Lily's house. "I knew something was wrong, but I kept telling myself he was fine." David, always the pragmatist, focused on the legal angles. "I've talked to 2 more attorneys. They both say the same thing. We might be able to sue for elder financial abuse, but it would be expensive and drag on for years." Lily, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Have either of you asked Dad how he feels about all this? Because I did, and he likes it there. He's making friends, he's eating regularly, he's taking his medications, he's happy." The uncomfortable truth hung in the air between them. For all the financial loss and manipulative tactics, their father was receiving good care in a pleasant environment. His daily needs were being met in ways they had collectively failed to address until it was too late. "So we just accept this?" David asked, incredulous. Margaret looked between her siblings, feeling the weight of being the eldest, the one who should have protected both their father and their interests. "I don't think we have a choice about the house," she said slowly. "But we do have a choice about how we move forward." The next day, Margaret requested a meeting with Evergreen's executive director. She brought spreadsheets, market valuations, and a side-by-side breakdown of what Evergreen would earn versus what her father would receive. "I'm not here to threaten legal action," she said calmly. "I'm here to appeal to your humanity. My father was exploited during a vulnerable time. You've already profited substantially from the sale of his home. I'm asking for some of that money to be placed in a trust for his additional needs." The director was polite but unmoved. "Mrs. Reynolds, your father entered into this agreement willingly. We provided all the necessary disclosures. If he had consulted with your family before signing, perhaps the outcome would have been different. It was a subtle reminder of the family's own failure, their lack of attention, their delayed intervention." Margaret felt the sting but pressed on. "Then let me ask you this. What happens if my father needs specialized medical care that isn't covered by your guaranteed care for life? What happens if he simply decides he wants to live elsewhere?" The director's expression betrayed nothing. "Those scenarios are addressed in sections 14 and 17 of the agreement. Your father is welcome to leave at any time, but the property transfer is irrevocable. As for specialized care, we provide transportation to medical appointments, but specialty treatments beyond standard care would be his financial responsibility." In other words, Harold was trapped. He could leave, but with no home and no proceeds from its sale, where would he go? And if he needed expensive treatments or medications not covered by Medicare or Evergreen's basic care package, how would he pay for them? Throughout the meeting, Margaret couldn't help but notice a woman sitting in the lobby, watching intently. Their eyes met briefly several times. The woman seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. The meeting ended with platitudes, but no concessions. As Margaret walked to her car, feeling defeated, the same woman hurried across the parking lot toward her. "Excuse me," the woman said, slightly out of breath. "I've been hoping to catch you. I'm Susan Winters. My mother lives here too." Susan's story was distressingly similar. Her mother had signed over a valuable condo in exchange for lifetime care, only for the family to discover that lifetime care had significant limitations. "There's a group of us," Susan explained, "family members who've gone through this same situation. We meet monthly to share resources and support each other, and we're working with a state senator to introduce legislation addressing these predatory practices." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a flicker of hope, not necessarily for recovering what was lost, but for preventing other families from facing the same devastating surprise. That evening, she visited her father, bringing his favorite lemon bars from the bakery near his old house. They sat on his small balcony, overlooking Evergreen's manicured grounds. "I'm sorry, Maggie," Harold said suddenly, his voice small. "I thought I was doing the right thing, making things easier for you kids." Margaret looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw not just the confusion and decline that had worried her, but the proud, loving man who had always tried to protect his family, who was still trying in his way. "I know, Dad," she said, taking his hand, "but it was never your job to handle everything alone. We should have talked more, really talked." Harold nodded slowly. "Your mother always said I was too stubborn for my own good." A faint smile crossed his face. She would have read that entire contract and asked all the right questions. "She would have," Margaret agreed, feeling the familiar ache of missing her mother, now compounded by watching her father fade. "But we can't change what happened. We can only figure out where to go from here." Over the following months, the Bennett siblings established a new routine. They created a small fund for their father's personal expenses, the newspaper subscriptions, special snacks, and occasional outings that made life more than mere existence. They attended family council meetings at Evergreen, advocating not just for their father, but for all residents. And Margaret joined Susan Winters' group, adding her project management skills and growing legal knowledge to their advocacy efforts. Together, they gathered stories, compiled data, and built a compelling case for legislative change. Harold's health continued its gradual decline. The episodes of confusion became more frequent, confirming the early dementia diagnosis that had been missed, or perhaps strategically overlooked, during Evergreen's evaluation. On Harold's 79th birthday, the family gathered in Evergreen's private dining room. There was cake and gifts, but more importantly, there was honesty, conversations about finances, health, and choices that had been avoided for too long. "I've been thinking," Harold said as the evening wound down, "about what I would do differently." He looked around at his children and grandchildren. "I was so afraid of being a burden that I made decisions in isolation. But family isn't about carrying burdens alone. It's about sharing them." Lily, who had been quiet for most of the evening, reached for her father's hand. "Dad, I always defended your independence," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I never thought about how lonely that must have been for you, feeling like you couldn't ask for help." "We all made mistakes," she continued, looking at her siblings. "But we're still a family. The house was just a structure. What matters is that we're here, together." 6 months later, Margaret stood before a state legislative committee, her father's story one of dozens she had helped document. The proposed Elder Care Transparency Act would require enhanced disclosures, independent legal review, and cooling-off periods for life care agreements involving property transfers. "My father believed he was protecting his family," she testified. "Instead, he was exploited during a vulnerable time by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing." This isn't just about money or property. It's about dignity. It's about families having honest conversations before crisis points. And it's about an industry that should be held to higher ethical standards. The bill faced significant opposition from the senior living industry, but garnered bipartisan support. When it passed 9 months later, Margaret brought the news to her father, along with a framed copy of the bill's text. Harold was having a good day, clear-eyed and present. He studied the document, then looked up at his daughter with pride. "You turned our mistake into something good," he said. "That's what matters in the end." As he dozed off in his chair, Margaret sat watching him, reflecting on the painful journey they had taken. The house was gone, the physical structure that had held their family memories. But in its place was something unexpected, a new kind of relationship rooted in honesty, not shielding, in mutual care, not quiet sacrifice. And for families across the state, Harold's mistake would now serve as a protection, a legal guardrail preventing others from facing the same devastating surprise. It wasn't the legacy anyone had planned, but it was meaningful nonetheless. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across her father's face. Margaret thought of her mother's rose bushes, now likely replaced by whatever landscaping the developer had chosen. Some losses couldn't be recovered, but others could be transformed into something of value. As Harold Bennett slept peacefully, his daughter made a silent promise to turn their painful experience into a resource for others. The house was gone, but the lessons it taught would endure. Financial advisor Jennifer Ramirez has spent 20 years specializing in elder care planning. Her advice for families is straightforward. When it comes to seniors and housing decisions, everyone needs to slow down. These life care agreements can be appropriate in some situations, but they require careful scrutiny by independent legal counsel. Never use the facility's recommended attorney. She emphasizes that family conversations about assets, inheritance, and care preferences should happen long before crisis points force rushed decisions. The key takeaways from Harold's story are these. First, get independent legal review of any contract involving property transfer, ideally from an elder law attorney with no connection to the facility. Second, understand that guaranteed care for life often has significant limitations and exclusions buried in the fine print. Third, compare the actual market value of the property against the projected cost of care to ensure the exchange is genuinely fair. And finally, remember that these decisions impact the entire family. They should never be made in isolation, regardless of how independent a parent wishes to remain. By planning carefully and communicating openly, families can help aging parents maintain both dignity and financial security, creating a legacy of care that honors everyone's needs. If this story resonated with you or someone you know, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content that helps navigate the complex terrain of retirement and family finances. Share your thoughts or personal experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else facing similar challenges. And remember to hit the notification bell to stay updated on our weekly uploads. Join our Goldprint community as we continue to explore the financial and emotional journeys that define our later chapters in life.